The Historian Who Collected Dreams Chapter 1. The city that never slept. In the heart of Victorian London, the city never truly slept. Even on the quietest nights, when fog rolled in thick along the cobbled streets and muffled the clip-clop of distant horse-drawn carriages, there was always a pulse, faint and steady, like the soft breathing of the world itself. Gas lamps glimmered through the haze, their golden halos reflecting in puddles left by an earlier rain. Windows glowed faintly, revealing solitary figures bent over books, flickering candles, or the slow turning of wheels in quiet workshops. The city moved and breathed in rhythms invisible to most, a subtle symphony of life hidden behind brick walls and chimneys. Tucked away along a narrow street, sandwiched between two tall brick buildings, there stood a house that few ever noticed. Its facade was unremarkable, red bricks darkened by fog and soot, windows narrow and tall, and a heavy oak door with no nameplate to hint at the wonders inside. But inside, it was a world apart. A quiet sanctuary of time, where every shelf was stacked with books, journals, and bundles of papers tied with string, where candlelight flickered gently over parchment, and where the faint aroma of ink and wax hung like a comforting blanket in the air. This was the home of Elias Wren, a historian unlike any other. By day, he walked the streets of London quietly, observing the city's hidden patterns, the way fog softened the clamor of the marketplace, how lamplight reflected in puddles as if the stars themselves had fallen to earth, or the gentle sway of a lamplighter's ladder as he moved from one street to another. He spoke little, smiled only occasionally, and preferred the company of his own thoughts to that of people who moved too quickly, laughed too loudly, or spoke without care. Elias's fascination, however, was not with monuments or political history, nor with royal lineages or battles fought and lost. His obsession was with something far more delicate: dreams. He believed, as few others did, that dreams were more than fleeting images behind closed eyelids. They were fragments of history, memories of lives lived or imagined, whispered truths that the world had forgotten or chosen to ignore. And so, each night, as London softened into silence, Elias lit a slender candle, drew the curtains against the fog, and prepared to receive the dreams that would come to him. The first time he had realized the power of dreams, it had been on a particularly cold evening. He had returned from a walk along the foggy Thames, the river glowing faintly under the gas lamps, its surface rippling with reflections of distant chimneys and the occasional drifting boat. Exhausted and chilled to the bone, he had settled at his desk with a cup of warm tea and an open journal. It began as a whisper, barely audible over the soft crackle of his candle. A single image flickered behind his eyelids: a child running through a garden filled with flowers that seemed impossible in shape and color. The laughter of the child, bright and musical, reached into the room, and Elias felt it as a physical warmth, as if the sound had weight. He wrote the scene in his journal with care, noting every detail: the way the petals shimmered in the sun, the way the grass bent under tiny feet, the sound of the wind in the leaves. And when he looked up, the vision had vanished, leaving only the faint trace of scent, like lavender, lingering in the air. From that night onward, Elias understood. Dreams were not only fleeting images. They were living, breathing fragments of life, delicate threads that could be captured and preserved if handled with care. And so, he dedicated himself to their collection. Each night, as London's fog thickened and the city's hum softened to a whisper, he would open his journals and wait. Sometimes they arrived slowly, gently, like a feather drifting through a window. Other times, they came in surges, a rush of colors, sounds, and scents that filled the room and spilled over the edges of the candlelight. Elias lived quietly among these dreams. He moved softly through the narrow rooms of his house, careful not to disturb their fragile threads. The ticking of his clock, the creak of the floorboards, and the occasional whisper of the wind were the only interruptions to the rhythm of his nightly work. Outside, the city slept, or seemed to, but inside, every flicker of candlelight, every stroke of his quill, kept him connected to something larger, a hidden pulse that ran through the streets, the alleys, the bridges, and the fog itself. And so, night after night, Elias Wren continued his work, a solitary figure in a city that never truly slept. He collected dreams with gentle care, preserving them like precious manuscripts, and in doing so, began to understand the subtle music of time itself, the way the past and the present, the imagined and the remembered, intertwined in delicate, invisible threads. By the time the candle burned low and the fog thickened outside to a nearly tangible veil, Elias would lean back in his chair, quill in hand, and listen. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faintest echo of life. A carriage rolling slowly over cobblestones, the soft murmur of a voice from a lit window, a cat padding carefully along a rooftop. And in the hush, he felt the presence of the dreams, waiting, whispering, ready to be captured and preserved for another quiet night in the city that never slept. Chapter 2. The Historian's Life by Day. Elias Wren moved quietly among the streets of London, a shadow among shadows, observing the city in ways few noticed. The fog rolled along the alleys like a living creature, curling around lamp posts, swallowing the edges of buildings, softening the city's rough edges. He enjoyed the solitude, the way the mist blurred the boundaries between what was seen and what was imagined. He often walked slowly, taking small, deliberate steps, listening to the distant clatter of carriages and the faint murmur of voices carried on the wind. Each sound, each movement, seemed to hold a story, a tiny history waiting to be remembered. Elias never hurried. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with a rhythm he found soothing, and the occasional flower girl, carrying a basket of violets and lilies, would pass by without noticing him, humming a soft tune that mingled with the fog. He sometimes paused to watch a lamplighter climb the iron ladder, lighting each lamp with care, a small ritual that transformed the streets from shadows into pools of warm light. All of this, the sights, the sounds, the quiet interactions of strangers, he absorbed and carried home with him, storing them in the quiet corners of his mind until nightfall. His house, narrow and tall, seemed almost impossibly quiet in the daytime, yet it held a sense of life within its walls. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, some stacked in precarious towers along the floor. Papers tied with string and bundles of journals filled the desks, tables, and windowsills, each one containing a fragment of a dream, a memory, or a whisper from the past. Elias moved among them with a deliberate care, as if each object held its own heartbeat, each page a delicate thread of the world's hidden history. He spent his afternoons in the city's libraries, wandering between the tall, dimly lit stacks. The smell of aged paper and ink was a comfort, a gentle reminder that even as the city roared and whispered outside, there were places where time slowed. In these sanctuaries, Elias would trace the edges of manuscripts, read letters penned centuries before, or simply sit in quiet reflection, letting the soft echoes of history settle around him like dust motes dancing in sunbeams. He had little interest in politics, wealth, or fame. His world was the delicate, unseen fabric of life, woven together in the smallest gestures, the quietest moments, the half-remembered dreams of ordinary people. Evenings were when his true work began. As the fog thickened and London's sounds softened into a distant lullaby, Elias would return home and light a single candle. The flame flickered against the walls, casting tall shadows that danced like spirits, bending the room into a liminal space between waking and sleeping. He opened a journal, dipped his quill into ink, and waited. The dreams arrived in myriad ways. Sometimes they were gentle, arriving as faint impressions at the edge of awareness. A scent of jasmine that seemed out of place, a whisper of laughter that faded when he turned to look. Other times, they came fully formed, as vivid as life itself. Elias would write them carefully, detailing the colors, textures, and sounds, as well as the emotional weight that clung to them. Each dream was a story unto itself, a fragment of memory, imagination, or possibility, delicate yet enduring. He learned to move with the rhythm of the dreams, breathing softly, allowing the quill to glide across the page without disturbing their fragile threads. Sometimes he would pause to close his eyes, letting the images expand within his mind before committing them to ink. Occasionally, a dream would linger longer than expected, leaving a soft echo of warmth or melancholy in the room, like the faint aftertaste of honey or the gentle chill of a winter morning. On particularly quiet nights, Elias would walk to his study window and gaze out across the fog-laden streets. He imagined the lives of the people below, a mother quietly soothing her child to sleep, a lamplighter finishing his rounds, a night watchman standing at his post. All were small threads in the vast tapestry of the city, and all might one day drift into a dream that found its way to him. He understood, in those moments, that his work was not merely recording dreams. It was preserving the heartbeat of the city itself, a quiet catalog of existence in a world that moved too quickly to notice. Elias's life was simple, almost monastic in its rhythm. Meals were modest, often bread, cheese, and tea, eaten in silence. His home was tidy in ways that mattered. Journals stacked neatly, quills aligned, candles trimmed and ready. He did not seek company, for the city's whispers and the dreams themselves provided companionship, each night a conversation with the unseen. And yet, even in this quietude, there was a subtle tension in Elias's life. He could feel the pull of something larger, a thread that connected him not only to the city but to the dreams themselves. Sometimes he awoke from a nap during the day with a lingering echo of laughter, a scent of flowers, or a half-remembered melody from a dream that was not his own. He carried these fragments with him, knowing that when night returned, they would join the tapestry he preserved, and that the line between what was real and what was imagined would begin to blur ever so gently. Thus, Elias Wren lived his days in quiet observation and his nights in devoted collection, a historian not of kings or battles, but of life's most delicate and ephemeral truths. In the city that never slept, he moved like a soft note in a larger symphony, attentive, careful, and fully present to the rhythm of time and dreams. And as the candlelight flickered each evening, casting tall shadows on the walls of his study, he prepared once more to open himself to the invisible, whispering world that awaited him, a world of dreams that only he could preserve. Chapter 3. The first dreams arrived. The first dreams that Elias recorded did not announce themselves with fanfare. They came quietly, like leaves drifting on a still pond, arriving at the edges of his awareness before spilling into the room. On one particularly still evening, the fog thickening outside to a near silence, Elias lit his slender candle and settled at his desk. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the faint scent of ink and candle wax, and waited. The first image appeared softly, like the brush of a feather against his mind. A garden unfolded, vast and sunlit, unlike any he had ever seen. The grass was impossibly green, bending gently beneath the feet of a little girl with hair spun gold like sunlight itself. She ran among flowers of colors he could scarcely name, petals that glimmered with faint silver dust, blossoms that swayed with a music he could almost hear. Her laughter rang out, clear and musical, and Elias felt it as a warmth that reached through the candlelight to touch his fingertips. He opened his journal and began to write, careful not to disturb the fragile thread of the dream. Each detail mattered. The way the sunlight dappled through the branches of impossibly tall trees, the scent of the flowers mingling with the clean, sweet aroma of the earth, and the soft breeze that carried a faint melody as though the garden itself was singing. He wrote until the candle's flame flickered low, tracing every sensation and every color with painstaking care. When he finally looked up, the garden had vanished. Only the faintest echo of laughter lingered in the quiet room, and the smell of lavender, delicate and fleeting, whispered from the corners of his study. Elias leaned back in his chair, quill in hand, and realized that the dream had left more than an image. It had left a feeling, a presence, subtle but insistent, as if the dream itself had chosen to remain with him. In the nights that followed, more dreams arrived. Each was unique. Each carried its own rhythm and tone. One evening, it was a soldier lost at sea, rowing a small boat beneath a sky that blazed with stars unfamiliar and bright. Elias could feel the chill of the waves, the salt spray upon his cheeks, the soft sway of the vessel beneath unseen hands. He wrote with careful, gentle strokes, as though the quill itself could transmit the life of the dream onto paper. Another night, he found himself following a poet wandering the foggy streets of a city that mirrored London yet was entirely unreal. The poet carried verses unspoken, whispered into the wind, leaving trails of imagery in the air, words that smelled faintly of rain, that shimmered like reflections in puddles, that seemed to reach directly into Elias's memory. He copied the verses into his journal, capturing not only their words but the weight of their unfulfilled longing. There were quieter dreams as well, single moments, fleeting but persistent. A mother rocking a child in a dimly lit room, a baker placing warm bread on a windowsill, a street musician humming a melody that never left the mind once heard. Elias recorded these with the same care, knowing that even the smallest gestures, the simplest echoes, held the heartbeat of life itself. He learned to wait patiently, to sense the arrival of each dream rather than summon it. Some nights the dreams were gentle and slow, arriving as images or sounds or scents. Other nights, they poured into him in surges, vivid and overwhelming, demanding the full span of his attention. Yet he never resisted. The dreams were not possessions. They were visitors, fragile and fleeting, and his role was to honor them, to preserve them, and to let them pass when their time came. Elias began to notice patterns among the dreams, subtle threads that connected them. A child's laughter might echo in a street musician's melody. A flower in one dream could appear in another, blooming in a different season or under an alien sky. He began cataloging these connections in small notes along the margins of his journals, tiny maps of emotion and memory, threads that intertwined as delicately as spider silk. Sometimes, as he wrote, he felt the presence of the dream not only in his mind but in the room itself. The candle flickered as if in response, the shadows lengthened, and the air seemed to carry a faint vibration. Elias did not fear these occurrences. Rather, he accepted them as part of the rhythm of his work. The dreams were alive in ways that he could only begin to understand, and he was learning to move among them like a quiet companion, walking softly so as not to disturb the fragile harmony. By the end of the first month of his work, Elias had amassed dozens of dreams, each meticulously recorded. Yet he understood, even then, that he had only scratched the surface. Dreams were endless, like rivers flowing beneath the streets of London, invisible yet persistent. They were alive, fragile, and infinitely varied. And as he leaned back in his chair one fog-laden night, listening to the distant murmur of the city outside, Elias Wren realized that his life had changed. He was no longer merely a historian of the past. He was a custodian of something far more delicate and eternal, the living, breathing history of dreams themselves. The city that never slept carried on outside, but within the quiet walls of Elias's study, a new rhythm had begun, a rhythm of ink on paper, of whispers in the air, of dreams arriving and departing like gentle waves. And in that rhythm, Elias found not only purpose, but a strange, calming companionship, a presence that would remain with him through the fog, through the long nights, and through the gentle unfolding of countless dreams yet to come. Chapter 4. The River of Dreams. As the nights deepened and the fog clung ever thicker to the cobblestones of London, Elias Wren began to notice something extraordinary. The dreams he recorded no longer arrived as isolated moments, quiet and separate. They began to flow together, like tributaries merging into a vast, invisible river that wound through his study and beyond, threading through the city and the world itself. One dream would ripple into another, forming patterns he could trace only with patient observation, and Elias, quill in hand, became both witness and navigator, gently charting the currents. One night, a particularly vivid dream arrived first as a scent, the tang of salt and the faint sweetness of a flower that did not exist. Closing his eyes, Elias saw a ship adrift on a moonlit sea, its sails catching a silver light that seemed to hum with an unfamiliar melody. On the deck, a young woman leaned over the railing, gazing at the water with a longing that spoke of memories she could not name. Her hair streamed behind her like a veil of night, and the gentle rocking of the ship mirrored the soft sway of Elias's own heartbeat. He wrote everything. The cold press of the salt wind on her skin, the shimmer of the moon on the waves, the sound of water lapping against the hull in quiet, rhythmic whispers. Before he could lay down his quill, the dream shifted. The ship became a library floating through clouds, with corridors lined by towering shelves, and the young woman wandered among the stacks, reaching for books she could not read, yet somehow understood. The air smelled faintly of ink and paper, tinged with the aroma of an unseen garden, and faint music floated in from somewhere beyond sight. Elias traced every detail, amazed by the way the dream had evolved, flowing naturally, seamlessly, like water finding its way through channels long prepared yet invisible to the eye. Other dreams arrived in succession, each joining the river in its own way. A soldier lost at sea appeared, rowing a small boat through a foggy harbor, only to see the girl from the garden standing on a distant pier, her golden hair catching a lantern's glow. A child played beneath a fountain in a city that seemed at once familiar and entirely unreal. The water carried the scent of honey and rain, reflecting spires that did not exist on any map of London. A musician wandered foggy streets, humming melodies that had been sung in dreams centuries ago, and Elias felt their harmonies weaving through the room, touching the candle flame, threading through the journals stacked on the floor. Each night, the river of dreams grew stronger. Elias learned to move with it, to anticipate its shifts and eddies, to capture its currents without disturbing its fragile beauty. He often paused, closing his eyes to allow the subtle motions to unfold within him before committing them to paper. Sometimes the river seemed to rise around him, filling the room with color, scent, and sound, yet always remaining delicate, whisper-light. He would write until the candle burned low, until his hand ached, until the quiet hum of London outside reminded him that the world beyond his walls continued, unaware of the wonder contained in this small, hidden room. Elias began to notice patterns among the dreams that he had not seen before. Colors repeated, melodies drifted from one dream to another, and subtle emotions threaded through multiple visions. Joy intertwined with sorrow, longing met with gentle resolution, fleeting fears dissipated into soft light. He began to draw connections in small diagrams along the edges of his journals, arcs and lines representing the flow of dreams, symbols for recurring figures, faint notations of moods and scents. It was a map not of streets or rivers, but of the intangible currents of memory, desire, and possibility. One particularly long night, the river became nearly overwhelming. Dreams arrived in a torrent, a queen gazing across a golden desert, a scholar reading by candlelight in a library that floated above the clouds, children playing in fields where the wind carried invisible melodies, a cat moving silently through the corridors of a palace that existed only in memory. The room seemed to swell with life, the candlelight flickering against the walls as if trying to keep pace. Elias did not fear the flood. He embraced it, letting the quill follow the river, recording each detail, each sensation, each subtle emotion. It was in these nights that Elias began to feel a shift within himself. He was no longer simply observing the dreams. He was part of the river, flowing alongside it. The lines between what was imagined and what was real blurred. He could feel the salt on the ship, hear the music in the floating library, smell the honey-scented fountain. The dreams had become more than threads. They were currents that intertwined with his own consciousness, and he realized, with both wonder and quiet unease, that his life had merged with the very fabric of these visions. Yet even as the river grew and intertwined with his being, Elias felt a profound sense of calm. The dreams were not chaotic. They had a rhythm, a subtle harmony that required patience and care to understand. He moved through them like a quiet guardian, guiding them gently onto the pages of his journals, preserving their flow while allowing them to remain alive and free. And as he wrote, the city outside his window slumbered under the thick fog, unaware of the invisible river that carried the histories, possibilities, and memories of countless lives through the quiet hours of the night. By the time the candle had guttered and burned low, Elias would lean back in his chair, quill in hand, and listen to the faint echoes of the dreams lingering in the room. Each night, the river would recede slightly, leaving traces behind, a scent of jasmine, a faint shimmer of moonlight on paper, the quiet pulse of music no one else could hear. And each night, he knew that tomorrow, or the night after, the river would return, flowing again, weaving together fragments of life and imagination, history and possibility, in a gentle, endless current that only he could navigate. Chapter 5. Blurring the lines as the nights stretched on, Elias Wren began to sense a subtle shift in the nature of the dreams. They no longer arrived only in gentle currents or isolated visions. They began to touch him more directly, brushing against the edges of his waking life. The border between the real and the imagined thinned like fog under a rising sun, and Elias could feel it in the small, almost imperceptible ways. A flicker of movement in the shadows, a whisper of melody drifting from the corner of a room, a faint scent of flowers that existed only in memory. One evening, he sat at his desk, quill poised, candle flickering. The river of dreams began to flow again, carrying with it visions of a city floating above the clouds, where towers curved like smoke and streets wound in impossible patterns. He wrote diligently, following each thread as it twisted and turned. But as he worked, he realized something extraordinary. The sound of the distant streets of London outside, the clip-clop of a carriage, the whisper of wind through alleyways, seemed to harmonize with the dreams themselves, creating a gentle symphony in which reality and imagination were inseparable. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. The room shifted subtly, the shadows stretching and bending, the candlelight dancing in response to unseen currents. A figure appeared in the corner, a woman he had seen before only in a dream, standing by a window that did not exist. She smiled at him, her eyes reflecting the glow of impossible stars, and for an instant, he felt the weight of her presence as though she were made of the same air he breathed. Elias did not startle. He only smiled faintly and returned to his writing, realizing that the dreams had begun to extend into his waking world. In the following nights, the blending grew more pronounced. The sound of laughter from a child playing in a garden drifted faintly from the street below, though the street was empty. The scent of salt and jasmine lingered in his study, though no flowers or water were near. Shadows of figures who had appeared only in dreams moved subtly across the walls, vanishing if observed directly, yet leaving traces that Elias could feel, a warmth on his skin, a faint echo in his mind, a gentle tug at his heart. He began to understand that he was no longer a mere observer or recorder of dreams. He had become a participant, a vessel through which the currents flowed. The journals on his desk were no longer simply records. They were portals, delicate maps of worlds that existed not only in imagination, but in a space that bridged sleep and waking. Elias moved among the dreams as one moves through water, aware of their currents, sensing their pull, adjusting his movements to maintain balance without disturbing their fragile beauty. One particularly quiet night, a dream arrived with extraordinary intensity. A boy wandered through streets that mirrored London, yet shimmered with unfamiliar light. He paused at a fountain that glowed faintly, water rippling with the reflections of distant towers, and Elias felt the boy's wonder as if it were his own. The boy turned and spoke, not with words, but with a soft vibration that resonated in the air. Elias's quill moved of its own accord, tracing the shapes of the boy's emotions onto the paper. And in that moment, he realized that the dreams were teaching him to perceive differently, to feel the world beyond mere sight and sound, to understand the unspoken language of possibility. As the nights wore on, the experiences became more immersive. Elias found himself walking along streets that existed only in dreams, feeling the uneven cobblestones beneath his feet, smelling the warm scent of bread baking in an imaginary bakery, hearing the faint strains of a melody that had never been written. Sometimes he awoke to find traces of the dreams lingering in his study, a faint shimmer of color on a wall, a whisper of laughter carried on the breeze, a candle flickering in a way that seemed almost deliberate. And yet, he was never frightened. There was a profound calm in the merging of worlds, a sense of purpose in his role as custodian. The dreams were delicate, infinite, and precious, and Elias understood that he was part of their flow. He became a quiet bridge between the waking city and the vast, invisible river of imagination, moving through both with gentle care and reverence. By the end of the week, the line between Elias and the dreams had blurred almost completely. He could feel the currents in his own heartbeat, hear the whispers in his own thoughts, sense the presence of the unseen figures around him as if they were companions in the room. The journals filled rapidly, a record not only of dreams, but of the subtle interweaving of reality and imagination. And as he leaned back in his chair, candlelight flickering softly across the walls, Elias Wren realized with serene clarity that he had become part of the dreamscape itself, a quiet guardian flowing within the river of endless possibility. Outside, London remained as it always had. Fog drifting over the streets, carriages rolling along cobblestones, lamplighters climbing ladders, a city alive yet unaware of the hidden world beneath its ordinary rhythms. But inside Elias's study, the invisible river of dreams moved with gentle, persistent energy, carrying him along, merging his consciousness with its currents, until the distinction between waking and sleeping, between imagined and real, faded into a soft, harmonious haze. Chapter 6. The final entry. The nights had grown long, and the fog clung like a soft blanket to the streets of London. Elias Wren, now intimately familiar with the rhythms of the River of Dreams, felt a quiet anticipation each evening, as though the currents themselves were calling him forward. The journals on his desk were stacked high, brimming with inked memories, imagined lives, and whispered possibilities. Each page vibrated faintly, a soft resonance that Elias sensed more than heard, a heartbeat of the world folded into paper and ink. One evening, he lit his candle and took his place at the desk with a serenity he had never known before. The city outside was unusually still. Even the fog seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. Elias felt the subtle pull of the River of Dreams, a gentle tug at the edges of his consciousness, and he knew that the night had come for his final entry. Not a final entry in the sense of endings, but a culmination, a weaving together of the dreams, memories, and unseen currents he had collected throughout his life. The first dreams arrived in a cascade, delicate yet vast. A child danced in a field of silver flowers, laughing with a joy that made the air shimmer. A poet traced words in the misty streets, sending them like ribbons into the wind. Lovers separated by centuries held hands across impossible distances, their warmth touching Elias as if through an invisible thread. The river flowed through him, filling his study with colors, scents, and sounds that existed nowhere else but in the delicate spaces between thought and imagination. Elias began to write, slowly at first, then with increasing fluidity. His quill moved as if guided by the currents themselves, tracing patterns that he did not consciously design, but that he instinctively understood. He wrote of cities that shimmered above clouds, forests whose trees whispered the language of forgotten times, seas that sang lullabies to those who would never sail them. He wrote of the invisible connections between dreams, the subtle harmonies that linked joy with sorrow, longing with fulfillment, and memory with imagination. As he wrote, the presence of the dreams grew stronger. Figures that had appeared only in visions now seemed to linger in the corners of his study. The little girl in the garden smiled faintly from a shadowed nook. The soldier at sea nodded as he drifted past the window. The poet waved a hand in acknowledgement before dissolving into the faint shimmer of candlelight. Elias did not startle. He recognized them as companions, gentle presences accompanying him in this final act of preservation. The line between waking and sleeping continued to dissolve. He could feel the texture of clouds beneath his fingers, smell the salt of unseen oceans, hear the soft music of invisible instruments. His quill moved effortlessly, translating the intangible into ink, until the candle flickered with a golden intensity, as if drawing its light from the very river flowing through the room. Elias's heart beat in time with the currents. He felt both entirely himself and entirely part of something larger, a quiet, harmonious unity with the world of dreams he had spent a lifetime collecting. And then he paused, quill hovering above the page, candlelight casting tall, wavering shadows. Elias realized the ultimate truth. He was no longer merely the historian of dreams. He was now part of the river itself, a living thread woven into its infinite tapestry. His body, his mind, and his essence were merging with the currents, flowing gently into the landscapes, cities, and lives he had preserved. There was no fear, only an enveloping calm, a sense of purpose fulfilled. With a final, deliberate stroke of the quill, he wrote the last lines in his journal, words that held the entirety of his devotion, his understanding, and his surrender to the invisible currents of possibility. The candle flame rose slightly, then settled, steady and unwavering. The air around him shimmered faintly, carrying the scent of jasmine, honey, and distant seas. The room was filled with a gentle hum, the quiet resonance of the river flowing around him, carrying him forward. Elias Wren did not leave the world abruptly. He drifted slowly, imperceptibly, like mist rising from the Thames at dawn. The little girl in the garden waved. The poet's melody lingered. The soldier smiled and disappeared into the silvered horizon of his own vision. And finally, the historian himself became part of the river he had nurtured, a quiet presence flowing through dreams and memory, threading through the streets of London and beyond, whispering in unseen corners and empty rooms. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm. Fog curling around lamp posts, carriages rolling over cobblestones, distant church bells marking the passage of time. But in one small, narrow house on a quiet street, a candle burned softly. Journals lay open with inked dreams, and the river flowed gently, carrying with it the essence of a man who had devoted his life to preserving the delicate, eternal beauty of imagination. And sometimes, on nights thick with fog, when the gas lamps cast pools of golden light along the streets, passers-by say they hear the faint scratch of a quill, a soft melody drifting through the air, or the laughter of a child in a garden that exists nowhere else. Those who notice it never quite forget, for it is the gentle, enduring presence of Elias Wren, historian of dreams, flowing eternally in the quiet river that runs beneath the city that never sleeps. The historian had become part of the dreams themselves, and in his surrender, he had preserved them perfectly, delicate, infinite, and alive, a river flowing quietly through the night, waiting for those who might one day listen and drift into its calm, mysterious currents. Thanks for listening.